Welcome everyone to NCEA's Rigor and Relevance Framework, the Bridge for Catholic School Community and the CCSS webinar. My name is Kate Reich and I am the organizer, and I'm on hand to help with any technical questions about today's event. My colleague, Kathy Mears, wishes to have been here as well, but she extends her apologies for missing this event tonight. Before we begin, I have some housekeeping matters to share with you. First, please know that all of your microphone connections with today's webinar have been muted. During the presentation, you may ask questions or provide comments for the presenter by using the chat and/or question functions located in the GoToWebinar panel on the right side of your screen. To use these functions, click on the chat or question bubble and then click into the blank box area and enter your question using your keyboard. Then click Send. We also invite you to post your questions on todaysmeet.com. I am just sending out the URL for that. It is todaysmeet.com/RRJAN14. It's a website that is tracking questions and comments from our previous webinar this evening, and we certainly invite you to join in and add to the conversation. Secondly, the webinar presentation will run for 45 minutes, leaving some time at the end for the presenter to answer any questions that you provide. Third, you will be asked to complete a brief evaluation about this webinar later today or this evening, and your feedback is greatly appreciated. Lastly, this webinar is being recorded, and you will all receive a copy of the final recorded presentation, which we will email to you once the recorded file is available. I am pleased to present Sue Nelson of the Archdiocese of Milwaukee. Sue is the Associate Superintendent for Curriculum, Instruction, and Assessment, and over the course of the past 3 years, she has presented extensively on the Common Core state standards among state, regional, and national audiences. We are very excited to learn more about Sue and more from Sue about Common Core implementation and how it affects our Catholic schools. Please welcome Sue.
Hi, Kate. Thank you very much, and good evening to all of you. I'm very pleased that you're joining me today, and I hope this will be the first of a three-part discussion on rigor, relevance, and the Common Core state standards. As Associate Superintendent for Curriculum, Instruction, and Assessment, as Kate said, my work with the Common Core started 3 years ago, and so we have been on a very long journey at the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, and I think we've really gotten to a good place. If you are not in a diocese where the Common Core state standards are a hot topic, praise the Lord. If you're in a diocese working to convince your community that the Common Core will not strip away your Catholic identity, welcome to my world. We in Wisconsin have a very interesting political landscape. We have 5 dioceses in our state, and each of them has its own dynamic. So we have bishops trying to kind of maneuver this whole question of the Common Core state standards, and all of us taking a slightly different tack in all of it. In the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, we really have just decided that it is really not productive to try to, for example, explain the difference between standards and curriculum to people who aren't educators. There are so many misunderstandings that it just doesn't seem like energy well spent. So rather than getting into the semantics of are you adopting, are you aligning, and trying to find the word that will put people's mind at ease, we've really just redirected the whole conversation to our curriculum. We have our curriculum posted on our website, and so we've just decided that we'll have people go directly to what we're teaching, kind of skip over that whole Common Core standard question and say, here's what we're teaching. So you can react to us based on what we're teaching. So we're hoping that that's going to kind of move the conversation in a more productive way, because we know that the shifts identified in the Common Core are necessary to prepare students for their future. That's a given. So regardless of where your diocese is coming down on this issue, the way we teach and the way we assess is going to be impacted. So the conversation, framing the conversation as rigor and relevance, I think really takes us to a place where we can be talking about what we should be talking about. You know, we know that the content and the materials we select to develop the content are really the tip of the iceberg. They're the most public right now, but they're not really the issue. It's more about what's under the surface that represents the greatest challenge to us. And that's how will we teach and assess students who will live and work in a world that's evolving in a way that I would imagine will be very different from our own. So whatever your situation is, I'm hopeful that looking at this through the eyes of a rigor and relevance framework will be beneficial to you. Today, for part one, we're going to be focusing on the first outcome, and that is use the rigor and relevance framework to reflect on and refine current practice. Parts 2 and 3 will really get to the instructional shifts, as you can see, and assessment and grading practices. And that will be much more specific to the grade or discipline that you teach. Please note there is a time change for part 2 on January 28th, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail at the end of the presentation. This is the Rigor and Relevance Framework. It is available, and I have already posted a lot of the links or references to this stuff from the first session, the questions that were asked. So you will be able to find anything I'm referencing in that dialogue in today's meet. But this is found at International Center for Leadership and Education. Their website has every resource that you can imagine, and I'm very impressed with this group in that so many things that I think many companies or groups would sell or have as copyrighted materials are available to everyone. So I think it's just something that we can all make use of. Willard Daggett and others are the ones who combined to put together this framework. And basically what they did is they took both Bloom's taxonomy, the knowledge taxonomy, we're all familiar with that, and matched it to what is called the application model, meaning what is it that we're doing with what we're learning. And it gives us a very nice grid that we can use to look at instruction and assessment. So let's start with the Bloom's taxonomy, or the knowledge taxonomy. This would be the rigor. If we're talking about rigor and relevance, this represents the rigor. And it's important that we have a common definition of rigor because, honestly, we probably could have great discourse on what that means as educators, and then people who are non-educators might define that in a different way. For purposes of this, rigor means framing lessons at the high end of the knowledge taxonomy. Notice I said at the high end. This doesn't mean harder. This doesn't mean we're going to read Shakespeare in 3rd grade or algebra is now taught in 5th grade. So harder is not the answer. It means a deeper conceptual understanding. And that sometimes can be a challenge when we're dealing with parents when they start to see us teaching in a different way than they remember when they were in school. One of the examples that I can relate from personal experience is the Common Core standards in mathematics are often perceived by people who aren't very knowledgeable as dumbing down the curriculum. And I've been very curious to figure out, what is behind that feeling, or what is guiding that notion of people that we're dumbing down. And when you look closely at it, it makes sense. Let me use a kindergarten example, so my apologies to high school folks. But one of the kindergarten standards, Common Core standards, is a focus on the numbers from 1 to 20. In the past, rote memorization counting to 100 was the norm. So now when we say we want them to have a deep understanding, conceptual understanding in number sense, with a focus on the numbers 1 to 20, unless we really define what that looks like and give a rationale for that happening, it can be very confusing to parents. It feels like it's dumbing down. Another situation I ran across was parents who were concerned that we were dumbing down because we weren't finishing the book, and that means their children wouldn't be prepared for algebra. So, as you get to upper grades, it's just a different conversation. The application model across the bottom deals with relevance. It's just very basic. Why do we learn this question? Why do we have to learn this? So our intent today is to use this framework to design tasks that ask students to apply real knowledge, deep conceptual understanding, knowledge of content, and in the best scenario in an unpredictable situation. And in doing that, it would appear that we would be giving them the skills that the Partnership for the 21st Century has identified as essential for future success. So it really does change our conversation. Now it's more about, it focuses not so much on teaching, it's more on the learning. In the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, we've been using the Rigor and Relevance Framework as a mental model, we call it, for 3 years, and it's really been very effective for providing a common language when we get together for district and local collaboration. As we go through this, we're going to go through each of these quadrants in the framework. I'm going to use the example of a service project that would be common to any Catholic school, and hopefully this will provide us with a concrete example but it will be inclusive because we've all had experiences in our schools with service projects. As I said, when we get to part 2, we'll be looking at this more grade and discipline specific. We really need to keep a focus on the fact that learning should be an active process. We really don't want the students to be the ones who are sitting back and watching the teacher do all of the work. So I'm going to go back to the previous slide let's see. So let's talk about quadrant. I apologize. Let's talk about quadrant A. This is the quadrant in which we say the teacher works. So it's entitled acquisition. It's bits of knowledge. There are things that you just need to know in a subject. They're important. You need to know basic facts in math. If you're an art teacher, students need to know the color wheel. If you teach middle school science, you need them to know what the symbols on the periodic table stand for. But in isolation, those things have no real value. So the purpose of what we do in the acquisition phase of things is laying the groundwork, laying the foundation. So let's put this in the context of a service project. Just picture this. Put yourself in a faculty meeting, and the discussion turns to Lent. I know we're jumping the gun a bit here, but the discussion turns to Lent. You traditionally have a school-wide service project for Lent. So the teacher who always handles these things, and I can just picture you now, you've got someone in your head on this one, gets out the calendar and schedule is determined for the service project. At the high school level, you could picture your campus minister working with some students and then coming back and reporting out at a faculty meeting. Another teacher suggests a food drive for a local food pantry would be a good cause for the Lenten season, and says he or she will contact them and arrange to have the food picked up. Another teacher volunteers to write a blurb for the parent letter. This is a quadrant A service project. It's not relevant. The students had nothing to do with it, and it's not tied to the curriculum in any way. In other words, the teacher works. And in an elementary school, it's kind of funny because I think you know how some of this goes. Who buys the food? Who puts the food in the backpack? Who brings the food to school if it's too heavy for the backpack? In other words, this really becomes an adult activity, and we're trying to avoid that. So let's take this service project and move it into quadrant B, which is application. This is the application model. In this quadrant, the students use knowledge. Our knowledge is there are people who need food in our community. Use knowledge to solve problems, design solutions, and complete work. At its best, the situations are unpredictable. In other words, it's not just a cut and dry decision, but there's some application of what's going on in the world comes into play. You know where we're going with this, and I'm sure most of you are extremely good at making service projects relevant. Because you start asking questions or answering questions like, why should the students care about this? Who will they be helping? What's the greatest need in our community? And what can they do age appropriately to help in a participatory way? So it is not a stretch for us to take a service project and move it into being more relevant. In other words, students work. They're engaged in a meaningful way. In quadrant C, we're moving up the knowledge taxonomy, so we're increasing the rigor. So students are extending and refining their acquired knowledge. They can use it automatically and routinely and analyze problems and create unique solutions. I cannot do this if I don't have a deep conceptual understanding of the information. This really gets to the question of what we teach and how we teach in an authentic and integrated way. In a service project example, all of the adults are involved. This is not the job of the campus minister or the middle school or religion teacher. It's not contrived. What I mean by that is there are many, many academic applications. There's much that we could do in Rigor in looking at the curriculum that we teach, whatever our area is. And we can make this part of what we do in a very authentic way. So, for example, kindergartners can graph food that is brought in. We could agree that graphing would be an appropriate outcome for kindergartners. Third graders can research what food items are in short supply. Fifth graders can contact food pantries in the area and decide which ones need the most help. Middle school students can calculate the cost of feeding a family of 4 that would meet the requirements of a healthy diet and discuss the implications of that on the poor. High school students can grapple with the root causes of childhood obesity. In other words, In Quadrant C, students think. Quadrant D, this is where we hope all learning leads. Students have confidence. They have the intellectual capacity, and they also have the ability to apply, or the opportunity, I guess, since we're pretty much structuring the situation for them, the opportunity to apply their learning. Students have the knowledge and can apply it. In other words, they think and work. This is where the highest level of rigor and relevance merge. The service project becomes embedded in their minds and hearts. When you think about it, as Catholic educators, our primary purpose is to make sure our graduates have the intellectual capacity to understand the issues they face in their community and in the country, in the world, and the intrinsic motivation to be involved in solving them. So it's not enough to know the issues, but we also, as Catholics, have to act upon that knowledge. Over the years, I've seen some wonderful examples of Quadrant D service projects, and I'm sure that you could contribute many on your own. Actually, two I'd like to refer to. One was a pastor generated, and it was very interesting. He got a grant. I have no idea, to be honest, where the funds came from, but he got a grant. And at the first liturgy of the school year, he gave each grade $50. And he said, it's your job. I want you to pay it forward. I want you to determine how you can use this $50 to do the greatest service to our community and meet the needs of those less fortunate, or those with health issues, or whatever they determined would be their cause. And he was going to have them report back to him at the end of the year. I think the interesting thing about this was he didn't put some artificial time frame on it. It was just something they were to do over the year. So they weren't pressured in any way to do this. But it was really, really interesting. The little kindergartners, as you can imagine, in this case, one of the little kindergartners' parents had cancer. And so the kindergartners decided that they really thought that they should raise money to help find a cure for cancer, because this would be something that would help this parent. And it went on in the different grades. But there was so much research and so much discussion, collaboration, to come to a consensus, you hear all the words I'm using, on how this $50 was going to be used. And they had to report back to the pastor on how it was used. An excellent, excellent example of a Quadrant D service project. The other one relates to, we often structure service projects in such a way that it feels like we are doing something for them. And some of you are probably in urban environments where your students are them. So we have to be so careful about how we approach this. What we don't want to do is do service projects where the students are not engaged, because it just doesn't send the right message. So as they look at all of this, and each grade, in the case of this particular school, each grade was responsible in a given month to come up with a project. They not only had to come up with a project, but they had to present the project to the student body. They had to explain what their cause was, why it was important, and get them convinced that they should get on board with it. So the presentation, the kindergarten, this was a school, this was done in a gym, and this was a school of 400 students, and the kindergartners did a presentation. So again, this is a Quadrant D service project. So we've got students working and students thinking. So I'm sure that you could add multiple examples of Quadrant D in this scenario. So basically what we're saying is that the goal in any instruction that we do is to move out of Quadrant A. Quadrant A is kind of the foundation. We need it. There are ways that we teach Quadrant A material. There are ways that we assess Quadrant A material. But we have got to move out. So ultimately the goal is to get to D. Now, does that happen every day, every week? Not necessarily. We have adults who've not reached Quadrant D in their faith development. We have college students who room with someone from another faith tradition who can't defend their beliefs. The key is whatever we are teaching starts in Quadrant A, but unless you know it will gradually move into another quadrant, you have to question why you're doing it. We're going to delve into this in much greater detail when we use this to discuss the application in other areas of the curriculum. But the bottom line is we need master learners, and master learners are not going to come unless we have master teachers. Okay, I'm just going to pause there for a moment and kind of let you take all that in on the rigor and relevance framework. So everything that we discussed from this point forward really is going to be based on that. What I wanted to do next is to relate this framework to the shifts in instruction that are called for in the Common Core standards. And again, framing that in a way to say it doesn't really matter if in your diocese you're using the language of adopting the Common Core. Whatever curriculum you're using, whatever you're teaching, needs to adapt to these changes. So let's just take a look at each of them. And what you'll notice is each of the shifts, and we're going to start with English Language Arts, each of the shifts is imposed over the Rigor and Relevance framework. The point here is not really to get into deep discourse about each of these shifts, but rather just to see how it relates in Rigor and Relevance. This increase in nonfiction texts, there's some misunderstandings going on about nonfiction texts, and you may have heard of them or you've had them brought to you. One of the greatest misconceptions, I think, going on is that the Common Core in some way is going to mean literature is no longer taught. English teachers are not going to be able to teach literature anymore. That couldn't be farther from the truth. When we talk about nonfiction texts, we know that they draw more from real-world situations. So we have research studies, scientific explanations, technical materials. You know, this shift says an increase in nonfiction texts. It says nothing about at the exclusion of literature. Anytime that comes up in a conversation, I have to think about the fact that the concern, we're hearing concern about the textbooks. Much attention now is being given to textbooks and what's in textbooks and what will textbooks look like in the future. And the textbooks are going to be the tools that will have us lose our Catholic identity. And I really have to sit back and think about that. And the way I respond to it, to be honest, is to say, as Catholic schools, since there have been textbooks, and I don't know how long we've had textbooks, maybe one of you does, you can tell us in today's meet, but since the first textbooks were written, I guess we could call the Bible a textbook, right? Early one-room schoolhouses. Since we've had textbooks, we've had to really be vigilant about making sure that we're not introducing students or using materials that are contrary to our Catholic teachings. And it's always been the case, and it always will be the case. Someone said, well, what textbook publishers are going to publish Catholic science books or Catholic fill-in-the-blank social studies books? And, you know, I said, no one now is publishing Catholic textbooks. That's our job. The textbooks have content, and as Catholic educators, it's our job to make sure that that component, the Catholic faith, is brought into everything that we do. So this increase in nonfiction text is just very, very practical. It's probably good at this point, too, to make sure that we're expanding our definition of text. It does not mean print text only, and that's certainly a change that our current students are going to be living with. We can't control the content that they're going to be exposed to. It would be nice if we could shield them from content that we don't believe in, but the fact of the matter is we can't. And text is a much broader conversation than a print text, so we need to deal with all of that. Next is content area literacy. We know that students learn through domain-specific texts, and those require higher reading levels than the ability to learn from what they read and apply it. So we really have to think about how we use the process, for example, of activating background knowledge. I use that example because I think sometimes in our intentions to make sure students can understand what we're doing or understand the material, we activate background knowledge but almost go overboard on it to the point where, honestly, they don't have to read the text to answer the questions. And that's what we need to really be looking at. We have to make sure that they are answering questions that are text dependent. They have to read the material before they can answer those. There's an author, and his name is Doug Buell, and I have him listed in today's meet. And he wrote a book called Developing Readers in Academic Disciplines. I would highly, highly recommend Doug Buell's work for any of you. His work tends to be more for junior high and high school teachers. That's his focus. But it's really interesting because he talks very specifically about how we teach science text and how we teach social studies text and how we teach to read and math. Every discipline, when you read in any discipline, there is a certain way you approach it. For example, if I'm reading like a mathematician, I read word by word. I really dissect what I'm reading, and I have to understand as I go word to word to word. Well, that's hardly an effective way to read social studies. It's hardly an effective way to read literature. So content area people, expertise, high school people, you have expertise in a discipline. You're the one who knows how you need to relate to and read your content. So when we say everyone is a teacher reading, that doesn't mean you're a reading teacher in the traditional sense, but what it does mean is you are the one who has the knowledge and that discipline to truly teach students how to read and understand it. So Doug Buell, I would say, is probably the best I've seen in this area. So I would strongly suggest him. Increased text complexity, that's a pretty obvious move from, you know, the low in the knowledge taxonomy and moving up, as well as in the application. This definitely moves students from low cognition to high cognition in what they're reading. There's structure, there's vocabulary, and there's the tools you use in literature. So that's really escalating as we read more complex text. I read an interesting article and it talked about, the statement was, a compilation of the top 40 books read by students in grades 9 through 12 show that the average text reading level is 5.3, barely above the 5th grade. So it's obvious we need to raise the rigor for them to be ready for the complexity of college and career-ready texts. Just a note of caution on this one, the Common Core standards really talk a lot about lexile level. And we have to, a cautionary note is that a lexile level is only one measure of text complexity. If you teach literature, you either read a poem or interacted with material where very short sentences and common words have deep, deep meaning. They're very sophisticated. The passages are very sophisticated. So as teachers, you're the ones who need to be the ones that can take a look at the material and make a determination if it's appropriate for your students. Focus on text-based questions. Well, if we focus on text-based questions, it means, as I have mentioned before, that students have conversations, but the conversations are dependent upon their pulling the information from the text. So, for example, if you're teaching literature and a character in a story is being bullied, the question you'd want to ask is, what in the text describes how the character is reacting to being bullied, not how would you feel if you were being bullied. So you can kind of see the distinction between those questions. The first being a text-based question. What are you reading? What are the words or what are the phrases that are telling you how this student is feeling or this child is feeling? When they answer how they would feel if they're being bullied, there's no interaction with the text. In the case of nonfiction, the rigor and relevance comes when you're drawing information from materials and composing answers. Focus on writing arguments. This happens to say writing arguments, but I guess I would add focus on writing arguments and oral arguments. If I think back to the earlier example of the student who can't defend their faith to a college roommate to a non-Catholic peer, I would say that the focus on arguments, the ability to synthesize information and to really deeply understand our faith and deeply be able to defend it and apply it. So the defense of our faith, really understanding it to say, well, why do Catholics do this? That I know, so there's the rigor. But also, I've got the application. If I'm a college student, I've got many, many choices and many ways that I can get myself into some trouble, right? I have moral choices to make all along as I go through the college experience or move into the workforce. So as I'm in that place, we have to have a solid foundation so that they not only have the knowledge that they need, but they can use that in making their decisions. So higher order thinking skills are required to summarize information from multiple sources. So the relevance here comes in their need to respond to ideas, events, facts, and arguments about the text that they read. Finally, academic vocabulary. And academic vocabulary, you'll notice how high that is in the framework. Academic vocabulary is a bit of a challenge in two ways. The first is, in any given textbook, if you think about the last chapter or unit that you taught, the number of words, they always have, here's the vocabulary you need to teach for this. The number of words, the vocabulary is extensive. Quite frankly, there is really no way that you're going to be able to deeply delve into each of those terms. It's an impossible task. So rather than default to write a definition of each and use it in a sentence, we need to take a look at it and say, all right, given all these words, I'm the discipline, I'm the expert in this discipline. Which of these words are critical? Have to have it, can't move forward without it. And those are the ones that you start to put to the top and really delve into a deeper understanding. So to kind of release yourself from the feeling that you just need to take every one of those words on an equal footing. A person I'm going to recommend, again, this is in the Today's Meet, I'm going to recommend in this particular area is Jane Marco, and her website is Marco and Associates, and she has written a book called Classroom Strategies for Dynamic Teachers. She's just excellent, and she really does work with faculty, and again, all of these people that I'm quoting to you, this is not specific to elementary or secondary. These people are very versed, or if you would have these resources, they would serve you well regardless of your grade level. But she's really good about showing strategies for teaching academic vocabulary and making decisions. What's also very neat about her work is she has within the book, for each of the strategies, she has a smartboard application. So you can use your smartboard in a way that it's not just a fancy whiteboard, but that you can really use it to use that smartboard in a way that will be very interactive in teaching academic vocabulary. So I certainly would like to recommend that to you. All right, that's the end of our conversation about the ELA shifts. So I, again, welcome all of you to start engaging here on today's meet if you have any comments about all that. But I think the main thing in English language arts is to think about how these shifts impact your particular teaching. And it's my theory that the shifts in English language arts for elementary are much less dramatic or challenging to teachers than at the high school level. And I'm going to flip that now as we move to the shifts in mathematics and say it's my opinion that the shifts in the Common Core are more significant and challenging in elementary than they are for high school. So we can talk about that a little bit at the end. But let's just move into the mathematics since we're rolling here. Shifts in mathematics. In mathematics, we significantly narrow and deepen the scope of how time and energy is spent in the classroom. This focus allows students to reach a deeper conceptual understanding and build a strong foundation. Back to my example of the Common Core and focusing on the numbers 1 to 20 in kindergarten. So that's the focus piece of it. In the Common Core standards for math, 3, 4, 5 are the grades where you really focus in on fractions, and that's where fractions happen. And by the end of 5th grade, they are well-versed in fractions. The 5th grade teacher doesn't reteach fractions, the 6th grade reteach, and so on and so on. And I know what I'm talking about here, and I realize how this might sound because I was a middle school math teacher, and if someone would say to me from my experience, hey, when they get to you in 7th grade, they're going to have fractions nailed, I'd go, yeah, I don't know about that. I don't think that's going to be the case. So we have to do something different to make that a reality, and that something different is narrowing what we're trying to teach and really make sure that they have it. We have a school in the Archdiocese that's been using a Common Core Aligned math series now for 2 years, and they're kind of our experimental group, if you will, and they are seeing incredible results, positive results, from teaching to deeper conceptual understanding. They're not in that reteaching mode as the children move from grade to grade. It's very good to hear. It gives you confidence in the direction that we're going. As I said, the coherence is just the movement from grade to grade. So if we're really got fractions nailed at the end of 5th grade, the logical thing is to move into ratios, proportions, rational numbers, all of those things start to happen, and then we move our way into algebra. So that coherence is important. One of the things that we're finding with parent concerns, as I said, I mentioned the algebra, and that's really also an issue of how does that transition look. And I firmly believe that this is going to require some serious collaboration between middle and high schools as far as just what does this look like. It doesn't matter if they're going to a Catholic high school. Some of our communities in our diocese, there is no Catholic high school for them to attend, but we really have to look at how are the high schools transitioning. The high schools in mathematics really haven't had to do anything new right now because the 8th graders that came to them this year in our diocese were taught and had the same content they always had. So there's nothing that they're going to be changing necessarily in their course content, but that's not going to be the case down the road. Another shift in mathematics is fluency. I have heard students aren't going to need to know their facts anymore. All they do is use calculators. That, again, is a fallacy. Students are expected to have speed and accuracy with simple calculations. What moves this to quadrant D is their ability to use that foundation, that numeracy, to understand and manipulate more complex concepts. So they're learning their basic facts, but the basic facts are leading to more and more rigorous work and they can handle that because they understand why it's working. As a math teacher, I remember we'd read the math problem and they'd say, okay, how do I know if I'm supposed to add or subtract, multiply, and divide for a problem? And you'd say, well, you just look, and there would be a word, and some of you can relate this if you've been around a while. There'd literally be certain words, and in the textbook, every problem had that word. So they didn't really have to think too much about whether they needed to add, subtract, multiply, or divide. They just would look for the word, and if the word wasn't there, wow, this is really going to be problematic. I'm noticing a comment about math textbooks, and I will definitely address that at the end. I think that's a good conversation to have. So fluency is still very important. Deep understanding, this is obviously quadrant D. We have to understand and use what we're learning. So as teachers, we're really charged with providing those opportunities. We need to have them demonstrate deep understanding, and they're going to do that if we have the appropriate application for them to do that. One of the things that I really remember as a teacher, I was fortunate enough to be part of a grant. This is many years ago, believe me, and I was fortunate enough to be part of a grant for middle school teachers, and the purpose of it was to help us teach to deeper understanding. And I have to laugh because this was a long time ago, and it wasn't like what was in vogue. It was just kind of interesting. So it was 2 weeks, and I was thrilled to be going. And I got there, and I felt pretty good. I was a good math teacher. I know math. I'm good at math. And so we were asked to divide, 3/4 divided by 1/2. No problem. We all know the drill. Reciprocal of the second number, multiply, good to go. That's not what they asked me to do. What they asked me to do was draw it and show why it worked. And I have to tell you, that was a come to Jesus moment for me. Because quite frankly, I had to think about that long and hard. No one had ever asked me to actually show why it worked. All I was ever asked to do with fractions was worksheets. All I was ever asked to do with long division was worksheets. In fact, in 4th grade, I just want to share with you, I was very good at long division. And my reward was I got to divide 4-digit numbers into 10-digit numbers by the time we were done, while the rest of the class caught up on division. I mean, it was craziness of what was going on. So that deep understanding, that was a very humbling moment for me, because I realized I may know how to do it, but I don't have a deep understanding. And yet, in my defense, I don't have a deep understanding because no one required me to, and I never had to use it in a way it was necessary. This is a big shift. Are you learning mathematics for the moment, or are you learning it for life? Is a question that we really need to address. Application, this is pretty straightforward. Application is about being able to use math in all content areas, and science would be a good example. I remember the science teacher coming to me and saying, just asking, the students in my 7th grade science class are really struggling. They have no idea how to deal with metrics. And I said, well, that's very interesting. A month ago in math class, we did metrics. So what a learning for us. I did metrics, but not in any way that they saw any application. They certainly didn't retain it to use it authentically. So that was not a good moment in my teaching career, but I think it was indicative of a lot of what happens. I read some research that said 40% of adults can't do the math that they need in everyday life. And they trace much of that to the 1st grade. Now, 1st grade teachers, I'm not talking about 1st grade being responsible for the ills of the world in mathematics, but the fact of the matter is it's in 1st grade where if you don't, in kindergarten and 1st grade where if you don't tend to that numeracy, where you don't tend to that really, really serious deep understanding, the students will be pretty much like most people. They will just do the math of the day, but they're not going to relate to it. And for those of you that are struggling with parents and asking questions about how you're teaching math, I've used that example with a number of parents, and it's really, it works, because they'll say, you know, you're describing my experience with math, and I can really see now how that has not served me well. So it's just one way to move to that. Dual intensity just talks about balance. You know, we're looking for deep conceptual understanding, but if we don't do anything with it, it's not going to do much for us. You know, think about, as a coach, really having extensive, intense drills and then never playing a game. It's not going to work very well. All right, those are the shifts in mathematics. So here's what we're going to do. There is a poll question that's going to pop up, and we're going to talk about that briefly, and then I'm going to look over here to our today's meet and start answering the questions that are coming across here, and see if there are anything anything else that you'd like to talk about? So let's look at the poll question. What would most effectively assist teachers in their efforts to raise the level of rigor and relevance in the classroom? I would like you to choose one. And what you're doing is you're saying, you know what, for me as a teacher, given my current assignment, grade, discipline, whatever, here's what I feel I need. If I have to prioritize these, and they're all necessary, so believe me, I'm aware of that, but if I had to prioritize these, what would be my priority? And as I mentioned at the beginning, the shifts in Common Core are definitely going to call us to all of this. We're going to need all of these things to be happening in our lives. All right, we'll just take a moment for that. And, you know, the purpose of this, quite honestly, I guess it's pretty self-serving, the purpose of this question. I think it will provide an interesting snapshot for me and for other diocesan leaders, and how do we really meet your needs. We'll be seeing those poll results shortly. Right. All right, while we're waiting, let's just take a look at some of our dialogue here. Okay, we've got a question. What math textbooks are being used by the school you spoke of using Common Core textbook? In this particular case, it was Go Math. It's a Houghton Mifflin product, and I'm not a salesperson for Houghton Mifflin. I just know that a number of our schools have adopted that, and Houghton Mifflin products have been pretty prevalent in our archdiocese, so this isn't really shocking. The big thing that you need to do is really make sure that when you're looking at materials, that these materials have been rewritten and are truly aligned to the Common Core, because I can tell you what's going to be happening, and it's already happening, is we got a new edition that's aligned to the Common Core, and what's different is the teacher's manual contains more resources for the teacher, and when you put the textbooks side to side, there's very little that's different. So this is a really interesting time. No matter what materials you're using, it's a very interesting time, because you've got textbook companies, everybody's running around to be Common Core aligned, and then Common Core becomes politicized. And so now, in some of our schools, honestly, in certain areas, if the schools buy a new book and it says aligned to the Common Core on the cover, and it will, they all will, it's problematic for them. So it's really kind of an interesting challenge for all of us when you start talking about, but the only thing I can say is they have implemented it with the program, regardless of what it is, with great fidelity. They are all in it together, and they spend a lot of time planning together. They're really putting 1,000% of their energy into all of this. Next question, what do you think of the New York State models available on Engage New York? You know, I feel that they're very solid. I certainly have referenced those for our teachers as a resource. I think the thing that I struggle with, and I continue to struggle with, is do teachers react best to having units designed for them and implementing them, or are teachers more inclined to want the curriculum, you know, the skills outlined, and then they go from there? I guess I should preface this by saying in the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, our curriculum has always been written skill specific. It is, by the way, available on our website. I will post that. Our curriculum is available to all. And the reason we've always posted it, but it's become more and more important for us, as I said, to try to tell people, here's what we teach. Don't worry about the Common Core. Just look at what we teach, and then we can have a conversation, and that's helped a lot. So what we do is say, all right, what grade are you interested in? 4th grade, fine. Go to our website, look at our math curriculum, look at the skills, because it's very skill specific, and then you tell us what is it that you see there that you think is wrong or is going to in some way infringe on our Catholic identity, and at least have the conversation on something concrete, because we just, you know, continually are getting caught up in this misunderstandings, and it's just not productive. So I think any time that teachers can see the curriculum well developed into a unit, and in many cases more interdisciplinary, because we really haven't talked about that, and honestly, the Common Core, all of these shifts, don't even use Common Core, these shifts really require us to teach in have a more interdisciplinary mindset. That's easier to do in elementary. It's much harder to do in middle and high school when you're very siloed in departments. But it's difficult to see how we're going to get to some of these skills for our students if we don't look at this in a little interdisciplinary way. So here we go. Best math book I've ever seen, all about rigor and relevance, long before Common Core, is investigations and connected math. Okay, so we've got someone who has had good experience with a product that is very effective. Good, thank you for sharing that, Karen. How do you feel students best come to deep understandings? I think that for a student to come to a deep understanding, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but I firmly believe that how we structure the learning is how they come to a deep understanding. Let me give you an example. This is a conversation we're going to have when we get to part 3, talking about assessments. Students come to a deep understanding if they have the leeway to actually learn with you and along the way. I think what often happens in our current grading systems is to get an A, you pretty much have to know it before it's taught. Because if you do a straight average of grades, and I really, really struggle, and it takes me a while to catch on, that A is elusive. I will never, ever reach it. So just the mindset of how we grade, I believe, is counterproductive to having students come to a deep understanding. They'll come to in my opinion, they'll come to a deep understanding when they're allowed to make mistakes and do over and just keep trying and have information presented in different ways, and they have the freedom to really, really learn it and not be penalized for it, which leads to grading. You know, what's the bottom line? Do they know it at the end? That's a different mindset for grading. So we will get into that very, very deeply when we talk about assessments. Now I'm just following down today's meet. I'm seeing the results of our poll, and you can check back later on the other groups, but it's pretty much mirroring what we saw in the other section. We're seeing 18% feel additional resources are the key, 34% professional development, 38% increased time for collaboration, 10% reliable data linked to outcomes. So not surprising. And someone in the last session talked about the fact that aren't they all really embedded? If it's done well, wouldn't they all be happening? And I would have to say I believe that would be the case. Investigations, another thumbs up to investigations. Question, what are the Common Core state standards for foreign language? I think we really need to kind of roll back a little bit, and this is another misunderstanding that's going on out there, and that is that the Common Core standards are English language arts and math. There are no Common Core standards. The group that wrote the Common Core standards for math and English language arts aren't writing standards for anything else. Other groups are writing standards. There's a new science, next generation science standards is being written, but that's not a Common Core project. So I think that's a little bit of a fallacy. So I would say the standards for language arts at this point most likely are still either the standards for your diocese, the standards for your state, or perhaps the standards for the different professional organizations for foreign language, so whatever you kind of tacked onto for that. So you're not going to really see a Common Core standard for foreign language. But I would also say if you look at the shifts in English language arts, I think some truly would apply. Thank you, Kathy, for your comment. What is the best book or author to help teachers with high school students to help them with close reading? You know what, Katie, I am going to, again, reference you to Doug Buell. I really think if you just Google him and take a look at some of his stuff, I think you're going to find a lot of interesting resources. That would be my suggestion as a starting point. And then I had made mention earlier, why do I think that elementary is more challenging for math and literacy is more challenging for high school, and the comment here is elementary teachers are much more comfortable with literacy than math, and I would agree. I think if you look at the shifts in English language arts, and as elementary teachers you work with those shifts, quite frankly I'm not sure your parents would see much difference. I don't see how this would be earth-shattering to them. I don't know an elementary teacher that doesn't use nonfiction to supplement. So I really do think that there's a comfort level, and even our training as elementary teachers certainly prepares us more. The reason I think it's more challenging for high school is, you know, that old adage, high school teachers, I'm not a reading teacher, I'm a science teacher, I'm in the history department. So we don't really mean it maybe in the way that it was interpreted in the past, but the bottom line is, as I described, if you're the history teacher at the high school level, or you're the science teacher, you are a reading teacher in that you are the one who can discern the most important vocabulary. You're the one that knows how you read to understand that discipline. So yes, you are a reading teacher in that respect. So That was my rationale for that. I also would say at the high school level, math, I talked about that. You know, the math department's really, as long as the math department content prepares the students for the ACT at the high school level, that's where the parents' heads are. I mean, they just want to talk about ACTs, and if you're getting them ready for ACT, it's all go. Let's see, Kathy is telling us check out Tim Shanahan and close reading. Thank you. Probably can tell that I'm a little leaning towards expertise in math given my background, so I truly appreciate all of this. And then Aaron's looking for the poll, but Kate, I think the poll was closed. So Aaron, I apologize for that. So folks, I am looking forward to being with you again. If you choose to join us for part 2, I do want you to note the time change for part 2, and I am very grateful to NCEA for accommodating my schedule for that. On January 28th, we're going to be doing a session at 4 o'clock Eastern Standard Time and then 6 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, and that will get me to our Catholic Schools dinner in time for the program, so when the Archbishop introduces me, I'll be there. So hopefully we'll see you there. And as I said, our focus on that day will definitely be on looking at applying the strategies to apply this in your content area. I see another question here. Let's see. Let me go. Okay, let's see. This is a follow-up to deep understanding. Is it something the teacher can explain, or is it a matter of working with something long enough to come to an understanding on their own? Very, very interesting question. So that's just something to ponder. A teacher, I think, can guide. A teacher can explain, but I think that the caveat here is that sometimes we take, they're learning to drive it, we take the wheel. Does that make sense? I mean, we explain because we're helping, but just by virtue of over-explaining, we take away that discovery process, and if I have to discover it, I'm going to retain it longer, if I'm the one that feels the success of figuring it out. So I really think that it is a time issue. I do believe that they need time to come to an understanding. I've heard all sorts of cliches. Guide on the side, coach, whichever one you want to put in here. But yes, I do really think that a teacher can lead the journey, but the cautionary thing here is just don't over-explain, because then you just kind of take control of the situation. This is probably a response to the implications of the Common Core in elementary and secondary. The Common is generally yes about lit and math with elementary teachers, but not always. Agreed. Nothing is absolute. And finally, what do you think about having the students collaborate to discuss the deep understanding of a lesson? I think anytime students collaborate with structure, it's going to be a very positive experience. And as we move into part 2 and start talking about what the lessons look like and how we can do this, not just in the long term, but in the short term on a day-to-day basis, we can get to some of those concerns or some of those questions. So I am going to need to leave you now because we are getting to the end of our time. I just want to leave you with this thought. Achieving high levels of rigor and relevance is not a single event, but rather a constant journey over time with colleagues. And that is what I'm hoping we can facilitate. And as diocesan leaders and principals, I truly hope that we are of greatest assistance to you on your journey. So Kate, I'm going to thank everyone for participating. And I will put the website for our curriculum for the Archdiocese of Milwaukee. If there's any interest in that, you're certainly welcome to look at it. So Kate, thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Sue, for your time and for everyone participating. That concludes today's Rigor Relevance Framework, the Bridge for Catholic School Community, and the CCSS webinar. We will be sending you an email in the next day or two with instructions on accessing the recorded webinar file as well as the presentation slides. We certainly invite you to visit todaysmeet.com/RRJAN14 for continued discussion and questions. Please be sure to visit www.ncea.org to view the schedule of upcoming webinars. Have a great evening.